So I am here to propose that we start right now and begin an epidemic of nonviolence, with this room and all the people in it as ground zero. And I propose that we use every methodology available to us to support the spread of this epidemic from person to person. And since the topic tonight is digital books, I want to challenge all of you who are thinking and working in this field to imagine what a digital book would look like that would accelerate the spread of thinking and actions of nonviolence throughout the world. But first, let's think about violence for a second. How many people here have been in a conflict? Okay, so most people. How many people have been in a conflict that was damaging? Did damage to you? Okay. How many people here have experienced violence or know someone who's experienced violence? Okay, thank you. So a lot of people, because violence is everywhere. And violence can be so persistent that it starts to seem like it's inevitable, but it's not. Conflict is inevitable, but violence is just a strategy. Violence is an action that we either choose or we don't choose in every instance. So I'm a conflict mediator. I've also been a dancer and a choreographer for 40 years. So I think about conflict and I think about violence in terms of action. Which actions are being taken and why? And when I first started studying conflict, what struck me was how often our first impulse in a conflict situation is to separate. And I wondered, what if our first impulse were to connect? What would be different? And then when I continued to work in conflict, I started to notice that this impulse to disconnect is the basis of violence. And so my question changed and it became, is it possible? Is it really possible to reduce the amount of violence in the world? And if it is, what would it take? And now I think that it is possible to reduce the amount of violence in the world. And what it takes is people who are willing and able to choose the action of connection instead of the action of violence. So this decision is one that we're already making many times a day, probably hundreds of times a day. We're choosing between connection and violence. But often, we're not doing it consciously. And we're not really differentiating between them. We kind of mix them up, or we camouflage violence as connection. Or maybe we just don't even notice what we're choosing because we're acting unconsciously, or we're acting out of fear or anger. So given that a lot of the time we're acting unconsciously in conflict, if we decide to begin this epidemic of nonviolence, how should we begin? I propose that we look at what might be seen as the most subtle, but is probably the most frequent kind of violence that we have in our lives, the way that we speak to and listen to each other. So this kind of violence happens all the time. And it can sound like this. Let's say you're in a conflict with your teenage child and about getting up in the morning, and you're up too early and you're already exhausted and you've just had it and you find yourself saying, "Would you just get up? Oh my God, stop acting like a 5-year-old. You're driving me crazy." Or maybe you're in a repetitive conflict with your partner and it's like they're so unreasonable and you can't take it anymore and you're finally like, "What is wrong with you? Oh my God, just shut up." Now, if we step back from these kind of violent actions and instead practice connecting, these kind of conversations might change. And they might sound more like, for example, with our child, we might say, "Okay, it's obviously really hard for you to get up in the morning. So let's sit down. Let's look at what is making this so hard. And let's figure out what needs to change. What can I do? What can we do to make this easier?" And with our partner, even if we're frustrated, we might say, Okay, so, obviously I'm not getting something about this. Can you explain this again? Tell me what you care about. Tell me what you're thinking. Now, we might think, okay, maybe I can change a few things that I'm thinking, but really what kind of an impact is that going to have on world violence? And anyway, why should I, or why should any of us, choose nonviolence if other people are using violence and we're just going to get our asses kicked? Here is why what we do matters. Research into violence has shown that one of the primary things that determines whether a person will choose violence or not is not whether they are violent by nature or by habit, but what they think the people around them will expect them to do. So if violence is common and normal and accepted, then people are much more likely to take a violent action on small and large scales. So violence is not a fundamental part of human nature. It's not an inevitable part of our lives. Violence is a strategy that becomes a habit that gets passed down through families and communities and cultures and institutions. So violent forces like poverty and racism and sexism and nationalism, or institutions like schools and prisons where punishment is often used instead of the restoration of connection, or family systems or cultural systems where violence has been the normal thing for generations. All of these systems come together and create this matrix of violence that feels so huge and so entrenched that it can seem like it's impossible for us to do anything. But the fascinating thing and the wonderful thing for me to consider is that all of these systems are human systems. They don't pre-exist. They're recreated every day by the people inside the systems. So every violent system, whether it's in our family, in our neighborhoods, in the global community, is created, maintained, and potentially dismantled or taken apart by us, by the actions that we choose every day. So, violence is common, but at the same time, people long for connection. They yearn for it. And one of our most basic needs is for connection and for belonging. But because violence is so common, we get used to it. We start to accept that it's normal on levels that range from the random violent comment at home to international war. So we reach for violence, even when it doesn't get us what we really want. But our habits can change through awareness and through practice, through conscious practice. So what does it mean to practice nonviolence? This might sound kind of abstract. What it means is that we can take it one situation at a time. We can choose nonviolence over and over. Because nonviolence is not some kind of a state that we're going to arrive in and then we'll be perfect. Nonviolence is a series of decisions that we will continue to need to make all throughout our life. Every moment we have the chance to choose a nonviolent approach, even if we were terribly violent in the past, no matter how many times we've messed up. We always have the chance to choose it now. And every time we choose a nonviolent approach, it's easier for us to do the next time. And this is one place where I think the digital world could come in very useful. How can the digital world help us practice choosing nonviolent approaches? And how can it help us practice together? So that when we, for example, are in a situation where a colleague comes at us with some violent kind of feedback and we find ourselves getting angry and we want to come back at them with the violence and we want to say something like, "Oh my God, you're such a bitch! Jesus, all you ever do is undermine me in front of everybody." Instead of that, we can try to practice connection. We can say, describe how their actions affected us and what we need. We can say, for example, okay, when you came in this morning and yelled at me in front of everyone, I felt so embarrassed and I was so angry. If there's a problem, I want you to talk to me in person, okay? In private. Or let's say our parents in the hospital and we're worried and we're having a problem with the staff. We can't get the information we need, and we can either spread violence and we can say, what is your problem? This is the worst staff I've ever seen. You're rude, you're incommunicative, and you're incompetent, and I've just had it. I'm not going to talk to you anymore. Or we can step back, explain what we need, what we feel, and create a connection that's useful because it works for both sides. So we can say, okay, look, I'm worried about my mom, okay? And I'm really frustrated at how hard it's been for me to get the information that I need. I need to talk to someone who can help me get an answer. Who is that person? So sometimes violence can seem like a really great and seductively effective shortcut that we can take. It feels like if we just yell at this person, or we hit them, or we force them somehow to do what we want, that we'll be able to solve the problem and get on with our life. But the truth is that the result of violence is damage, resentment, unstable situations, and the desire for revenge. So given how persistent violence is in our lives, how repetitive the cycles are in our personal lives, in our work lives, and out in the world, if we take it seriously and we decide to try to start an epidemic of nonviolence, are we just dooming ourselves to a life of pointless hard work to follow a principle? No. Because this is not about doing the right thing. This is not a moral question. It's not about being nice and forgetting our own needs and putting ourselves in a dangerous situation. Nonviolence is not about becoming a martyr. Building up our ability to act nonviolently in difficult situations is a practical choice, because nonviolence and connection work. They make our life better. When we are able to act nonviolent in difficult situations, we're much more able to recognize the complexity of situations, to express ourselves clearly, to listen to what other people say, even when we disagree, and to find and create vital, strong relationships and solutions that work even when we're in disagreement, by bringing the dynamic of real exchange into our lives. So we can either train our children in violence. So let's say you have a new partner and your child is not happy and you're so sick of the tension, you can't take it, and you find yourself saying, oh my God, would you just get over it, you little diva? If you don't like my boyfriend, just go in your own room, okay? He's not trying to be your dad. Oh my God. Or we can teach them to connect. We can say in that situation instead, okay, you're obviously really upset about this. What's bothering you the most about having my boyfriend here when you're at home? Or if we're trying to make complex decisions with people in the world, we can strengthen violent systems by saying things like, yeah, I heard you. Okay, obviously you don't trust me and you're going to try to force me to do it the old way, just like you always do. Or we can step back, describe what we're feeling and what we're needing, and even when we're frustrated and angry, and say something like, okay, so it sounds like you're wanting to have some more input on this, is that right? Okay, so let's talk about two things. One, I'd like to talk about these roles, so let's be clear on which decisions belong to who's responsible, and then let's talk about this particular decision and what's important to you and me, so we can move forward with a solution that works. So nonviolence is a mindset, and it's an action that literally changes our brain. What we practice the most is what we're able to access when things get difficult. And this is true not just in the smaller conflicts in our life, but even when we have been deeply affected by violence, when our minds have been changed, altered. Because what neuroscientists are finding is that the experience of connection and the exchange of nonviolent exchange can change cognitive patterns, and it can provoke the brain into building new neural networks that enable greater empathy and better decision making. So we're shaping our own brains with every action. We're shaping the brains of those around us with the kind of interactions that we create. So whether we're looking at violence on a structural level or on an interpersonal level, we're always coming back to the individual. We're always coming back to us and the choices that we make and the technologies that we develop to expand the reach of those actions. So the choice before us now and for the rest of our life in every action is to either strengthen the neural networks that we have that separate us or those that connect us. Every person in this room, every single one of us, is at the center of a vital, huge, responsive network that literally spans the world over and over, a human network. We're all connected, and what we do matters. When we build our capacity to have our first impulse be to connect, we have already started to dismantle, to take apart violent systems. So the question for me now is, are we willing and are we able to choose the action of connection instead of the action of violence? And if we're not, what would make it possible? How might the digital world be part of that? Let's find out. I would love to hear your thoughts about this later. Let's create an epidemic of nonviolence starting right now. Thank you very much.
Webmontag.